Hello there, Physically Debunked here, and welcome to the second part of my series addressing a version of the contingency argument for God's existence. Just in case you need reminding, here is the argument I'm interested in. It's known as the Modal contingency argument and was formulated by the philosopher Dr. Joshua Rasmussen. It's a particular favourite of Christian apologist Cameron Bertuzzi. In the first part, I addressed the first premise of this argument, that the universe can, consistent with reason, have an explanation for its existence. My analysis of this premise was, perhaps surprisingly, very positive. The vast majority of premises I see in arguments for God's existence I find to be pretty weak and vague. But this premise is different. I think that this is a good, solid premise to start an argument with, and I'm much more likely to accept it than to deny it. So the argument is off to a good start, but how does the rest of it hold up? In this video, I'm going to address the rest of the argument in its entirety. Is the whole argument as solid as its first premise, or does the rest of it let it down? In order to understand the argument better, let's split it into two sections. Each section is trying to accomplish something different. The first section of the argument is trying to prove that the universe can be explained in terms of God, that God can at least serve as a possible explanation for the universe. The second part of the argument builds on this and uses it to prove its ultimate conclusion that God does exist and exists in all possible worlds. In my previous video, I discussed the first premise of the first section and found it to be pretty good. So what about the rest? For now, I'm going to jump into the second section of the argument, which tries to establish God's existence from the conclusion of the first section. If we assume that the first section of the argument has successfully defended its conclusion that the universe can be explained in terms of God, is the second section then able to use this to establish the ultimate conclusion that God must exist in all possible worlds? Well, the first step is pretty secure. If the universe can be explained in terms of God, then it must be possible for God to exist. If God's existence were an impossibility, then it would not be possible to explain the universe in terms of God, since the universe cannot be explained by a non-existent entity. I cannot explain the existence of my whiteboard in terms of things that don't exist. So the step from 3 to 4 here is pretty good. Perhaps you could try and refute it by claiming that somehow non-existent entities can serve as explanations, but this would be a very strange, non-standard account of explanation. So we can get from 3 to 4 pretty easily. What about from 4 to 6? Well, to get from 4 to 6, we need an additional premise, which is number 5. Number 5 says that God cannot exist unless God exists in all possible worlds. Is 5 a plausible premise? Yes, again, 5 is a very plausible premise, and can in fact be proven so long as one assumes that if God exists, then he exists necessarily. In other words, God either exists in all worlds or none of them. If we assume this about God, then 5 holds true. God can't exist unless he exists in all possible worlds, since God is defined as a being whose existence would be necessary. While premise 5 is pretty solid, it does depend on a certain conception of God which not all theologians may share. Most theologians think of God as a kind of foundation for all existence, as a prime mover. Premise 5 makes sense for a God like this. If God is the foundation of all existence, it would not make sense for his existence to be contingent. There is no possible world without God because God is needed to ground the existence of any possible world. Not all theologians agree with this, but I think it's pretty safe to say that the vast majority see God as a necessarily existing being. I agree with them that this is the best description of God if he were to exist, so I'll run with it. On the whole then, 5 seems to me to be a very plausible premise. If we have 4 and 5, which I think we do, then 6 is an inevitable conclusion. If God can exist, then his existence is possible, meaning he exists in at least one possible world. But if he exists in one possible world, then he must exist in all possible worlds, and hence the conclusion follows. This whole second section of the argument then is extremely convincing. If we assume that 3 is true, then 4 follows. And if we accept 5, which is a very plausible premise, then 4 and 5 together give us the conclusion 6, that God exists in all possible worlds. So we've now looked at the first premise in the first section, number 1. And we've also looked at everything in the second section, numbers 3, 4, 5 and 6. What we've found is that all of these are very strong foundations for the argument to be built on. The only place I can see to pick holes in now is the second premise in the first section, number 2, which claims that the universe cannot be explained in terms of non-maximally great things. If this premise is just as good as the rest of the argument, then it's very difficult not to accept the theistic conclusion that there is a God and he exists in all possible worlds. So has this argument turned me into a theist? It hasn't. While I respect this argument and appreciate that it does have a lot of power, I think the second premise and the logical link between it and 3 is lacking. And if the second premise is false or fails to establish 3, then the second, very persuasive section of the argument cannot get off the ground. So let's take a look at the second premise of the argument and try to understand where it might be going wrong. The second premise states that the universe cannot be explained solely in terms of non-maximally great things. This needs a bit of unpacking. First of all, what do we mean by a non-maximally great thing? From my experience, many religious philosophers and theologians seem to have an obsession with the property of greatness. To these thinkers, greatness is a real, well-defined property, and the greatest possible being is the monotheistic God. To many theologians, the appearance of greatness in a philosophical argument is not all that controversial or surprising. But to me as a physicist, it causes quite a lot of concern. I don't think that greatness is a well-defined property at all. It seems to me just as vague and as undefinable as happiness is in utilitarianism. Is an apple greater than an orange? Is something greater if it's very complex, or if it's fundamentally simple? How are we supposed to determine how great any individual object is? This leads to the principal problem I have with this premise, which is that I don't think there's any such thing as a maximally great object. I just don't see any objective way of defining what it is to be maximally great. If God did exist, then perhaps you have your maximally great thing, and this would then serve to define what greatness is. But if the concept of greatness presupposes God's existence to be meaningful, then the modal contingency argument is circular. One of the premises is assuming the conclusion. Greatness is not well defined unless you presuppose that God exists and defines greatness. So we can't just assume that greatness is a well-defined property. We need to have good prior reasons to think that it is in fact well-defined. But what reasons might we have for believing this? To be honest, I can't really think of any good ones besides religious ones. All I can think of is why greatness is not well-defined. Consider other well-defined properties like electric charge. Every object in the universe has a well-defined electric charge. It makes sense to talk about the charge of any given object. Electrons are negatively charged. Most objects are neutral. And some entities can have very large electric charges. It even makes sense to talk about maximal charge. There's a theoretical limit on how charged an object could be. So things like electric charge are well-defined properties. You can quantify them objectively, and you can verify that the idea of a maximally charged entity does make sense and would be well-defined. I don't see how you can say anything similar about the concept of greatness. To me as a physicist, the only well-defined properties are physical ones. Something like greatness just doesn't strike me as something that makes sense. So if we go back to premise 2, do we have any good reason to believe it? Well, if like me, you don't think that greatness is a well-defined property, then there is no such thing as a maximally great object. This premise would then imply that no explanation for the universe is actually possible, since there are no maximally great things. This would in fact contradict the first premise that the universe can have an explanation for its existence. So if you think that the first premise is solid, and that maximal greatness doesn't make any sense, then you must reject the second premise. For me, saying that the universe can only be explained in terms of maximally great things is just as arbitrary as saying that the universe can only be explained by maximally red things. I don't believe the universe has to be explained by maximally red things, and since I see greatness as a property just as arbitrary and even vaguer than redness, I similarly don't believe the universe has to be explained by something that's maximally great. I think Rasmussen does realise, however, that this use of greatness is not going to appeal to everyone. So he does provide an alternative version of the premise that should be more appealing. Instead of saying that the universe cannot be explained in terms of non-maximally great things, he suggests the alternative, that the universe cannot be explained in terms of contingent things. In other words, the universe cannot be explained solely in terms of entities whose own existence requires explanation. This is something that is much more plausible to me. If we take this alternative reading of the second premise, does it improve the situation? A bit, but not really. The premise is no longer reliant on a questionable concept such as maximal greatness, but now there isn't really a good link between the truth of 2 and the conclusion of the first section, 3. In the original argument, we can see that 3 follows from 1 and 2 if we define God as the single, unique, maximally great entity. If the universe can have an explanation, and it cannot be explained solely in terms of non-maximally great things, then it must be the case that we can explain the universe in terms of the unique, maximally great entity, otherwise known as God. But if we banish maximal greatness from the argument, then we no longer have this link. Instead, the best we can get is an argument like this. The universe can have an explanation. The universe cannot be explained solely in terms of contingent or non-necessary things. Therefore, the universe can be explained by a necessary thing. Therefore, a necessary thing can exist. Necessary things can't exist unless they exist in all possible worlds. Therefore, there is a necessary thing that exists in all possible worlds. This new argument has all the strengths of the original, but now with an improved second premise, which is much more plausible. But the problem is, it's no longer really an argument for the monotheistic God. In order to generate a plausible argument, we've had to drop clear ties to God. At most now, this is an argument for the existence of a necessary entity. If we replace greatness with contingency in the argument, then you get what I think is a pretty good argument. But it really eliminates any clear connection with the monotheistic God. All the argument convinces me of is that something exists in all possible worlds. But I kind of believe this already. In theism, God is a necessary being, but God doesn't have a monopoly on necessity. There is no reason to believe that if a necessary entity exists, then it must be the theistic God. There may be multiple necessary entities, or there may only be one, but it bears no resemblance to the personal monotheistic God. It could just be a certain fundamental state of matter, or something like mathematics itself. So where has that gotten us? Overall, this argument is actually pretty good. It's a lot more powerful than most other arguments I've looked at, and the majority of it is very plausible. The problem I do have with it, though, is in the second premise. I simply don't think that this premise is true so long as it relies on such an undefined quality such as maximal greatness. It is possible to remove the dependency on greatness, and doing so yields a very persuasive argument, but at best, what's left is an argument for the existence of a necessary entity, not an argument for the existence of the monotheistic personal God. So let's give this argument a rating. The original argument gets an okay 5 out of 10 for being a fairly decent argument, but with a seemingly fatal flaw. The modified argument, however, gets a stellar 9 out of 10, but with the caveat that I think it's an excellent argument for the existence of a necessary entity, but not for the existence of the monotheistic God. I remain an atheist, but I do believe that something exists necessarily. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Please like and subscribe for more Physically Debunked.